People think danger announces itself loudly with symbols they already recognize, with words that sound obviously wrong. But the most effective threats never do that. They enter quietly, dressed as wisdom, tradition, or protection. They sit above your bed while you sleep, not because they need proximity, but because agreement is easiest when the mind is tired and the guard is down. Most believers don't realize this, and that misunderstanding alone has kept countless doors open that were never meant to be touched. I want you to listen carefully, not with fear, not with excitement, but with discernment, because what we're about to unpack is not about folklore, superstition, or regional customs. It's about how spiritual influence actually works, how it disguises itself, and why some things feel harmless while quietly training the soul to outsource authority was never meant to give away. This is not common teaching. It was never meant to be. And once you see it, you won't be able to unsee it. That is the part most people are in prepared for. Some of you have heard about hanging sachets of specific woods over the bed, passed down through Appalachian tradition, framed as a protection, as heritage, as something your grandmother knew long before modern religion complicated everything. 7 woods, natural materials, earth-born, untouched by modern corruption. That is how it is sold. That is how it's remembered. And that framing is exactly why it works so well, because the moment something is labeled natural, people stop asking spiritual questions. They assume neutrality. They assume safety. But nothing that interacts with belief, intention, or symbolism is neutral, ever. And the people who designed these systems understood that better than most church leaders do today. Here, as the part that should slow you down, protection is never just about what you were trying to keep out. It's about who or what you were agreeing to trust instead. Most Christians assume attacks come through obvious rebellion, through hatred of God, through open mockery. That assumption has made them blind to a quieter strategy that has always been more effective replacement. Not denial of faith, but redirection of it. Not abandonment of belief, but dilution. And nothing dilutes faster than adding just a little of something that feels old, earthy, and safe. This is where the conversation usually gets uncomfortable, because people want to defend tradition without examining its roots, or intention without examining its structure. But intention does not sanctify a system. Structure reveals alignment. And alignment is what determines influence. This is where most people stop listening, because it challenges something familiar. Stay with me, because familiarity is not the same as truth. And comfort has never been a reliable guide in spiritual matters. If you are still listening, it means something in you already senses that there's more here than a harmless charm. That instinct is important. Don't rush past it. What I am about to explain is something I learned the hard way, long before I understood how deeply symbolism trains the human spirit. Back then, I thought deception came through lies you could identify. I didn't yet understand that the most dangerous lies don't feel like lies at all. They feel like wisdom you simply hadn't considered yet. And once that kind of idea is accepted, it doesn't need to shout anymore. It settles in. It becomes furniture. It hangs quietly above your bed. Before we go further, let me say this plainly, because some of you need to hear it without drama. Subscribing to this channel is about entertainment. It's about staying aware of how belief systems quietly evolve around you. If you've ever wondered why certain practices feel spiritually off, but you could, to explain why, or why some teachings never sat right even though they sounded Christian adjacent, you in the right place. These conversations don't show up in most pulpits. They don't trend well, and that silence is not accidental. So if you want to stay a step ahead of subtle deception, not by fear, but by understanding, make sure you stay connected here. What is coming in future discussions builds directly on what we were opening today. Now, I need to establish something important about myself, not to elevate my voice, but so you understand the lens through which I am speaking. I did grow up suspicious of spiritual practices. I wasn't raised to question symbolism. In fact, for years, I studied it. I watched how belief is shaped, how rituals are constructed, how meaning is assigned to objects and actions. I saw how people are taught to externalize authority without realizing what they were doing. And I saw how often this was wrapped in language that sounded protective, ancient, or wise. I'm not speaking as someone speculating from the outside. I am speaking as someone who once believed that knowledge itself was power, before realizing that power always asks a question in return. Who are you aligning with? There were moments early on when I watched people cling to objects with more confidence than they clung to God, and they did to see the contradiction. They would pray sincerely, but sleep under symbols they never questioned. They would quote scripture, but defend practices that scripture never endorsed. And when things went wrong, when peace did come, when fear lingered, they assumed they hadn't done enough. That is how dependency is formed, not through force, but through quiet disappointment that teaches you to add more layers instead of removing the wrong ones. This pattern repeats across cultures, across centuries, across belief systems. Only the packaging changes. The reason the bed matters, and I'll go deeper into this later, is because sleep is not just rest. It as vulnerability. It as transition. Every ancient system understood this. That is why so many practices target thresholds, doorways, windows, beds, cradles. Not because those places are magical, but because the human mind is most suggestible there. You don't need to believe in something for it to influence you if you already agreed to its function. Hanging something for protection is already an agreement. The question is protection under whose authority and by what mechanism? Most people never ask that second question. They assume the answer is automatic. It is T. This is where I want you to pause internally, not emotionally, but intellectually. Ask yourself why protection has to be performed at all. Why does it require an object? Why does it require placement? Why does it require repetition across generations? Those questions are not attacks on faith. They are exercises in discernment. And discernment is not suspicion, it is clarity. When faith is clear, it doesn't need supplements. When authority is understood, it doesn't need symbols to reinforce it. That does mean symbols are always wrong. It means they are never neutral. And pretending they are is one of the most effective ways confusion stays invisible. I remember the first time I saw someone remove a so-called protective item from their space, not in fear, but in understanding. Nothing dramatic happened. No chaos. No backlash. Just clarity. And that's what startled them the most. They realized how much emotional weight they had placed on something that had never earned it. That realization is uncomfortable, because it exposes how easily we hand over responsibility for our peace, but it is also freeing. And freedom always begins with awareness, not action. Some of you might already feel a tension rising as you listen, a desire to defend the practice, a desire to say, but this is different, or it is just cultural. That reaction is important data. It tells you where familiarity is speaking louder than examination. I'm not asking you to reject anything blindly. I'm asking you to look at it honestly. Because deception does not survive scrutiny. It survives avoidance. And avoidance often wears the mask of respect, tradition, or tolerance. Here's the part most people never consider. The systems that promote these practices need you to stop believing in God. They only need you to believe God, as authority requires help. Once that idea is planted, everything else follows naturally. Objects become tools. Rituals become habits. Habits become dependencies. And dependencies quietly reshape faith. Not overnight. Slowly, gently, patiently. That patience is not random. It is strategic. And it is why practices like this persist long after their origins are forgotten. If I were encountering this idea for the first time today, sitting where you are, I know exactly what I would want someone to do for me. I would want shouting. I would want fear. I would want someone to explain the mechanism, not just label it as wrong. Because when you understand the mechanism, you don't need rules. You don't need warnings. You can see for yourself why certain things belong in a life rooted in faith. That is what we are building toward here. Understanding, not reaction. And this is where the conversation turns, because the real issue has never been the woods, the sachet, or the tradition. The real issue is what the act trains the heart to believe about protection, authority, and trust. Once you grasp that, you will start recognizing the same pattern everywhere, not just in this practice. And when you see how widespread it is, you will understand why this conversation matters more than most people realize. Once you understand that influence works through agreement rather than force, the entire landscape changes. Suddenly the conversation is about whether something looks evil or sounds forbidden, but whether it subtly retrains where you place trust. That's why so many practices survive scrutiny. They were never presented as replacements for faith, only as enhancements. And enhancements are rarely questioned. People assume that if something does contradict belief directly, it must be compatible with it. That assumption has quietly shaped generations of spiritual confusion. The truth is, compatibility is not determined by appearance or intention. It is determined by source and structure. And structure always tells the truth eventually, even when language tries to soften it. When I spent years studying how belief systems are built, one pattern kept repeating no matter the culture or era. The most resilient systems never attack core beliefs head on. They orbit them. They attach themselves just close enough to feel supportive, just distant enough to introduce something foreign. Over time, the original belief remains in name, but its function shifts. Authority migrates. Responsibility diffuses. The person still prays, still believes, still identifies the same way, but their internal compass has been adjusted by degrees so small they never felt the turn. That is why so many people feel spiritually tired without understanding why. They are maintaining multiple frameworks at once, and that tension drains clarity. The idea of hanging something above the bed is not random, and it's not unique to one region. Similar practices appear across continents long before modern borders existed. Different materials, different names, same logic. The bed represents the place where consciousness loosens its grip. Dreams, fears, memories, imagination all surface there. Ancient systems understood that if you associate protection with that space, you bind safety to an external object during the most defenseless hours. Over time, the mind learns a subtle lesson. Peace comes from placement, not presence. And once that lesson is learned, removing the object feels risky, even if nothing ever happened when it was installed. That is not protection. That is conditioning. One of the most common arguments people make in defense of these practices is that they always been there and nothing bad happened. But absence of immediate harm is not evidence of spiritual alignment. Many things don't injure outright. They redirect slowly. And redirection is far more dangerous because it does trigger alarms. It feels like normal life. I've seen people become deeply defensive over objects that never once delivered measurable peace. Yet the idea of removing them caused anxiety. That anxiety did. Come from loss of protection. It came from loss of familiarity. And familiarity is a powerful emotional anchor. Once something has lived quietly in your space long enough, it feels like part of you, even if it was never meant to be there. What complicates this further is the language used around these charms. Words like heritage, ancestral wisdom, old knowledge. These phrases carry emotional weight. They suggest continuity, belonging, identity. Questioning them feels like rejecting family, history, or roots. That emotional leverage keeps examination at bay. But spiritual truth is not inherited through bloodlines or regions. It is revealed, tested, and chosen. Respecting history does not require adopting every practice it preserved. Wisdom is not measured by age alone. Some ideas persist, not because they are true, but because they are convenient. There's something else most people miss. When a practice claims to protect without requiring moral alignment, repentance, or transformation, it should raise questions. True spiritual protection is relational, not mechanical. It flows from alignment, not arrangement. Any system that offers safety through setup rather than surrender is teaching a very different lesson, even if it never says so explicitly. That lesson seeps in quietly. People begin to associate peace with doing something rather than being rightly oriented. That is not faith. That is management. And faith was never meant to be managed like an environment. I've watched people stack practices the way others stack security systems. A prayer here, an object there, a saying repeated just in case. None of it malicious. All of it well-intentioned. But intention does to negate effect. At some point, the heart stops asking who it is trusting and starts asking whether it's done enough. That shift is subtle, but it is profound. It turns faith inward, toward performance, rather than upward, toward relationship. And once that happens, fear finds room to operate, because performance is never finished. There's always one more thing you could add, one more layer you could hang. When you step back and look at it honestly, you realize how unnecessary complexity becomes a substitute for trust. Simplicity feels risky to people who have been taught, even indirectly, that safety requires maintenance. That is why removing an object can feel harder than hanging it ever did. Hanging something feels proactive. Removing it feels exposed. But exposure is only frightening when you've been taught that presence alone isn't enough. That teaching does come from faith. It comes from fear, disguised as wisdom. I want to be careful here because some people hear this and assume the answer is to become hyper-vigilant, suspicious of everything, stripping their lives bare out of anxiety. That is not discernment. That is just fear wearing religious clothing. Discernment is calm. It is grounded. It asks questions without panic. It removes things without drama. It understands that nothing loses power unless it was falsely given power in the first place. When people react emotionally to the idea of letting go of a charm, that reaction reveals where the real work needs to happen. Not with the object, but with the belief attached to it. There was a time when I believed understanding symbolism gave me control. I thought knowing how things worked meant I could manage outcomes. That belief itself was part of the problem. Control and trust don't coexist easily. One always displaces the other. And many spiritual practices marketed as protection are really about controlling outcomes, controlling fear, controlling uncertainty. Faith, on the other hand, teaches something far less comfortable but far more stable, surrender. That word makes people uneasy, especially those who've been hurt or disappointed. So substitutes are created. Softer forms of surrender that don't feel like letting go. Objects, rituals, placements. They give the illusion of participation without requiring vulnerability. If you're feeling unsettled as you listen, that does mean something's attacking you. It means a belief is being challenged. Those are very different experiences. One produces fear. The other produces clarity after discomfort. Don't confuse them. Clarity often feels like loss at first because it removes something familiar. But what it gives back is far more valuable: coherence, a faith that doesn't need props, a trust that doesn't depend on environment, a peace that does change when furniture moves. You might be wondering why this matters so much. Why spend this much time on what seems like a small practice? It matters because small practices reveal large assumptions. They show how we think protection works, how we understand authority, how we respond to uncertainty. And once you see the pattern here, you recognize it in dozens of other places. Phrases people repeat without thought, habits passed down without examination, objects sold with spiritual language attached. None of them ask to replace belief outright. They just ask to stand beside it, and standing beside something long enough often leads to leaning on it. This is also why these conversations are uncomfortable for institutions. They require nuance. They require admitting that not everything labeled cultural or traditional is spiritually harmless. They require trusting people to think, not just obey. That kind of teaching does spread easily. It doesn't package well. It doesn't make people feel instantly better. But it does something more important. It strengthens discernment. And discernment does create dependency on teachers, channels, or voices. It creates responsibility within the listener. The opposite of manipulation. If I were sitting where you are, processing this, I would take inventory not of objects first, but of beliefs. I would ask myself where I've equated action with safety, and whether that equation actually holds up under scrutiny. I would notice what makes me defensive and ask why. Not to condemn myself, but to understand myself. Because understanding is the beginning of freedom. And freedom is always quieter than fear. There's a reason these discussions don't end cleanly. Once you start seeing how influence operates, it does stop at one example. It ripples outward. You begin noticing how often fear is disguised as care, how often control is disguised as wisdom, how often dependency is disguised as devotion, and that awareness can feel heavy at first, but it also empowering because it returns agency to where it belongs, not in objects, not in rituals, but in conscious alignment. And here, as the part that usually surprises people the most, nothing bad happens when you choose clarity. There's no backlash, no sudden chaos. The drama exists mostly in imagination, fed by years of subtle conditioning. What actually happens is quieter. The space feels lighter. The mind rests more easily. Not because something magical occurred, but because a false weight was removed. And once you experience that, you start questioning why you carried it at all. This is not about rejecting culture, history, or tradition wholesale. It's about understanding which parts serve life and which parts persist out of habit. Faith that cannot be examined is fragile. Faith that welcomes examination becomes resilient. And resilience is what allows you to move through a world full of mixed messages without absorbing every one of them. As we continue, the focus will narrow further because the real concern is any single practice. It as the broader strategy of how spiritual authority gets outsourced piece by piece. Once you understand that strategy, you need someone to warn you about every new trend or charm that appears. You recognize the pattern immediately, and that recognition is what keeps you grounded, not afraid, but awake. At some point, understanding stops being theoretical and starts becoming personal. That is usually the moment when people ask quietly what they were supposed to do with what they now see. Not in a frantic way, not looking for a checklist, but with a genuine need for orientation. That moment matters because it determines whether awareness becomes wisdom or just another layer of anxiety. And anxiety is not the goal here. Clarity is. The difference between the two is subtle but crucial. Anxiety focuses on threat. Clarity focuses on alignment. One contracts you, the other steadies you. If I place myself honestly where you might be right now, having listened this far, I know the temptation would be to jump ahead mentally, to scan my environment, to mentally inventory objects, practices, habits, almost like a security sweep. That impulse feels responsible, but it can also become a distraction, because the deeper work does start with removal. It starts with recentering. Before anything external is addressed, something internal needs to be restored to its proper place. Authority. Once authority is clear, decisions become surprisingly simple, and fear loses its leverage. One of the most persistent misunderstandings about spiritual safety is the belief that it is fragile, that it needs constant reinforcement to hold. That belief alone keeps people in a low-level state of vigilance that feels like devotion, but behaves like stress. True safety, the the kind that does depend on atmosphere or setup, does T flicker. It's not maintained through effort. It's lived from a position of trust. When people say they feel exposed without certain practices or objects, what they're really describing is unfamiliarity with that kind of trust. Not danger, just unfamiliar ground. I've seen people hesitate at this stage because they are afraid of doing something wrong. That fear often comes from years of being taught implicitly that mistakes invite punishment. So they freeze, waiting for certainty before moving. But certainty rarely comes before movement. It comes through it. And movement in this context doesn't mean drastic action. It means honest evaluation, asking why something is there, asking what belief it reinforces, asking whether it aligns with what you say you trust. Those questions, Don, require bravery. They require sincerity, theirs, also a subtle grief that can surface here, and it catches people off guard. When a practice has been part of your life for a long time, especially one tied to family or identity, questioning it can feel like questioning your past. People worry they were invalidating their experiences or the people who taught them. But understanding does not erase history. It contextualizes it. You can honor where something came from without carrying it forward. Growth does dishonor the past. It completes it. One thing I wish more people understood is that letting go does have to be dramatic to be meaningful. There is no requirement for confrontation, ceremony, or declaration. Often the most grounded shifts happen quietly, without spectacle. Drama feeds fear. Calm feeds confidence. If something no longer aligns, it can simply be released. The power people fear losing was never in the object. It was in the belief they attached to it. When that belief changes, the object becomes ordinary again. And ordinary things, Don, need to be feared or fought. Another layer that often emerges here is the question of responsibility. People ask whether they've somehow opened doors they shouldn't have, whether they've caused harm unknowingly. That line of thinking can spiral quickly if it's not grounded in grace. Awareness is not retroactive guilt. You can be accountable for what you did understand. What matters is what you do once you see. And seeing does obligate you to panic. It invites you to adjust. Adjustment is a sign of maturity, not failure. It is important to say this clearly. Fear is not evidence of danger. It's evidence of uncertainty. When uncertainty is resolved through understanding, fear subsides on its own. Trying to force fear away without understanding only drives it deeper. That is why these conversations matter. They replace vague unease with articulated insight. And articulated insight has weight. It steadies you. It keeps you from overreacting in one direction or becoming complacent in another. As people move through this process, they often notice a shift in how they interpret other aspects of their spiritual life. Things they once accepted without thought start to invite questions. Not cynical questions, but discerning ones. Why do I believe this? Where did this idea come from? Does it align with the core of what I say I trust? This isn't deconstruction for the sake of tearing down. It as refinement. It as strengthening the foundation by removing what does belong there. One of the quiet dangers in discussions like this is replacing one form of dependency with another. People can become dependent on constant warnings, constant analysis, constant vigilance. That is not freedom either. Freedom does require constant monitoring. It rests in confidence. Confidence comes from knowing where authority actually resides. Once that is settled, you, Don, need to scrutinize every new idea with suspicion. You recognize misalignment quickly and move on without obsession. There's also a communal dimension to this that often goes unnoticed. When individuals quietly realign, it affects the atmosphere around them. Not through confrontation, but through stability. People who are grounded, Don, need to argue. Their presence speaks. Others notice the calm, the lack of anxiety, the absence of performative protection. That often invites questions, not defensiveness. And those questions open space for conversation rather than conflict. If you're wondering how to talk about these things with others, especially those who are emotionally attached to certain practices, the answer isn't to lead with critique. It's to lead with understanding. Share what you've learned, not what you've rejected. Speak from clarity, not superiority. People resist being corrected, but they were often open to hearing how someone else came to see things differently. Your posture matters more than your conclusions. Something else tends to happen as people settle into this clearer framework. They become less reactive. Fear-based narratives lose their grip. Sensational claims dawn. Land as easily. The need for constant spiritual reassurance fades. That is not because threats disappear, but because confidence grows. A rooted person does need to be reminded constantly of who they are. They know. And that knowing shapes how they respond to everything else. This is also where discernment becomes less about avoidance and more about discernment of direction. Instead of asking, is this dangerous? People start asking, is this necessary? that as a much more powerful question. Many things are and harmful in an obvious way, but they are unnecessary, and unnecessary things tend to clutter faith. They complicate what was meant to be lived simply. Simplicity is ignorance. It is focus. I have noticed that when people release unnecessary layers, their spiritual life often becomes quieter but deeper, less performance, less anxiety, more consistency. Peace stops being something they chase and becomes something they inhabit. That shift does attract much attention, but it changes everything. It makes them less susceptible to fear-driven messaging and more anchored in what actually sustains them. If I imagine myself at this stage again, with what I know now, I would rush to replace anything I removed. I would sit with the space it left. Silence can be uncomfortable, especially if you are used to filling it with action. But silence reveals what you actually trust. If silence feels threatening, that is information. Not condemnation, just information. It shows where reassurance has been outsourced, and that awareness is the first step toward bringing it back where it belongs. There's a misconception that strength looks like constant activity. In reality, strength often looks like restraint. Knowing when not to add something, knowing when enough is enough. Faith that is always accumulating practices is often compensating for uncertainty. Faith that rests is not lazy, it's secure. That security does come from knowing everything. It comes from knowing what matters. As this understanding settles, people often feel a growing responsibility, not to police others, but to be honest about what they've learned. Not loudly, not aggressively, but clearly. Silence can be a form of complicity when it's motivated by fear of discomfort. But speech motivated by clarity doesn't need to be forceful. It simply needs to be available. Those who are ready will hear it. Those who err in T1, be harmed by it. The final thing I want to emphasize here is that nothing we've talked about requires you to live in opposition to the world around you. This is about retreating, isolating, or becoming suspicious of every tradition. It about being rooted enough to engage without absorption. You can appreciate culture without adopting its spiritual assumptions. You can honor history without reenacting its errors. That balance is possible, but only when authority is clear. Once authority is clear, the world becomes less threatening. Ideas lose their power to destabilize. Practices lose their mistake. Fear loses its urgency. What remains is discernment that feels calm rather than sharp, confident rather than defensive. And from that place, you are not constantly reacting to what might be wrong. You are oriented toward what is right. As we move forward from here, the lens widens again because the pattern we've been examining does stop with charms or objects. It shows up in language, habits, and assumptions that shape daily life. Seeing it here prepares you to recognize it elsewhere without effort, and that recognition is not a burden. It's a form of freedom. Across objects, habits, and borrowed practices, it consolidates. And consolidation brings coherence. Coherence is what allows you to move through complexity without absorbing it. You stop feeling like everything requires a response. Discernment becomes selective, not reactive. This is where the broader pattern finally comes into view. What we've been talking about is limited to charms, sachets, or folk practices. Those are just visible entry points. The deeper strategy, one that has existed as long as belief itself, is fragmentation. Divide trust into small, manageable pieces. Attach each piece to something tangible, something repeatable, something familiar. Over time, faith becomes a collection of supports rather than a single foundation. That fragmentation makes people easier to influence, not because they are weak, but because they are dispersed. A scattered focus is always easier to redirect than a unified one. You can see this pattern everywhere once you know how to look. In language that subtly shifts responsibility. In habits that promise peace, but require constant upkeep. In teachings that emphasize vigilance over trust. None of it announces itself as harmful. In fact, much of it presents as care. But care that trains dependence is not the same as care that cultivates strength. Strength does need to be reminded constantly that it's under threat. It needs to know where it stands. One of the clear signs that someone is moving out of fear-based frameworks is their relationship with uncertainty. Uncertainty stops feeling like an enemy and starts feeling like a normal part of being human. There's no rush to fill every unknown with an answer or a practice. Silence becomes tolerable. Waiting becomes possible. That is a radical shift in a world that constantly pressures people to do something, add something, fix something. Resting in what is already sufficient feels almost rebellious, but actually a return to simplicity. This simplicity does mean ignorance of danger or denial of complexity. It means understanding that not every challenge requires a tool. Some require trust. Some require patience. Some require nothing more than staying oriented. When people are taught that safety is always something to be manufactured, they lose the ability to sit with what already exists. That loss creates a market for endless solutions, each one promising to patch a gap that may not even be real. I've watched countless people move from anxious accumulation to quiet confidence, and the change is never loud. There is no announcement, no dramatic break. It shows up in how they respond to fear-based messages. They listen without absorbing. They consider without internalizing. They choose without panic. That posture is deeply unsettling to systems that rely on urgency to maintain influence. Calm people are difficult to manipulate because they are not chasing reassurance. This is also why sharing understanding matters, but how you share it matters even more. Information delivered with urgency can replicate the very dynamics it is trying to expose. It keeps people alert, but not anchored. The goal is T to replace one source of fear with another. S to dissolve fear, S authority altogether. That only happens when understanding is paired with steadiness. When clarity does T rush. When confidence does T shout. As you move forward, you may notice that others begin to ask you questions, not because you've said anything confrontational, but because something about your presence has changed. People are drawn to stability, especially in uncertain times. They may not articulate it that way, but they feel it. That creates opportunities for conversation that aren't forced. You don't need to convince. You don't need to warn dramatically. You simply share what you've come to see and let others decide what to do with it. There's a temptation, once you see these patterns, to feel frustrated with those who don't need. That frustration is understandable, but it's also a trap. Everyone arrives at clarity in their own time, through their own questions. Pressure rarely accelerates that process. Patience often does. Remember, many people are still operating under assumptions they've never been invited to examine. Offering that invitation gently is far more effective than demanding they accept it. Another shift that often happens here is a reevaluation of what spiritual maturity actually looks like. It stops being measured by how many practices you maintain or how alert you are to threats. It starts being measured by consistency, humility, and peace under pressure. Those qualities don't make headlines, but they endure. They also make you less susceptible to extremes, whether fear-driven or sensation-driven. Extremes thrive on instability. Balance dissolves their appeal. You may also find that as fear loosens its grip, compassion grows. Not a soft, permissive compassion that avoids truth, but a grounded one that understands why people cling to what they do. Fear is persuasive. Familiarity is comforting. Letting go can feel like stepping into emptiness. Recognizing that makes you less judgmental and more patient. It allows you to speak honestly without contempt, which is rare and powerful. At this point, it is worth reflecting on how easily important conversations get buried under noise. Algorithms reward outrage. Attention gravitates toward drama. Quiet clarity doesn't compete well in that environment, which is why it often spreads person to person rather than stage to stage. That is also why staying connected to spaces where these discussions can unfold thoughtfully matters. Not because they have all the answers, but because they resist the pressure to sensationalize. If you've found value in this way of examining things, not with panic but with depth, staying engaged with this channel helps maintain that orientation. Not so you can live in constant alertness, but so you can continue refining discernment without losing peace. Each conversation builds on the last, not to overwhelm, but to strengthen understanding over time. Awareness isn't a one-time event. It is a practice, but a gentle one. The most important takeaway from all of this is a list of things to avoid or remove. It is an internal shift, moving from managed faith to lived trust. Managed faith is always checking, adjusting, compensating. Lived trust rests, even while it remains attentive. That does make you passive. It makes you resilient. Resilience does come from preparing for every possible threat. It comes from knowing where you stand when threats arise. When you stand there, truly stand there, much of what once felt ominous loses its weight. Practices that once seemed necessary reveal themselves as optional. Messages that once provoked fear now register as noise. You become careless. You become selective, and selectivity is a sign of strength, not neglect. It is also worth noting that this clarity does isolate you from others. In fact, it often deepens connection. When you are not constantly managing fear, you have more space for listening, for empathy, for presence. You are not scanning every interaction for danger. You are engaged. That engagement is grounding for others as well. It creates environments where honesty feels safer, where questions can be asked without shame. As life continues, new ideas, practices, and trends will appear, each promising some form of protection, enhancement, or insight. You need to memorize warnings about each one. You will recognize the familiar structure immediately. Does it ask for trust outside of what already sufficient? Does it introduce fear to sell reassurance? Does it complicate what was meant to be simple? Those questions will arise naturally without effort, and answering them won't feel heavy. It will feel obvious. In the end, what dismantles subtle deception is exposure alone. S. Integration. Integrating understanding into how you live, how you choose, how you respond. That integration happens slowly, quietly, and it lasts. It does depend on constant reminders. It becomes part of how you see the world. If this conversation has given you language for things you've sensed but could, articulate. That is not an accident. Many people carry unspoken unease because they lack frameworks to examine it. Giving that unease form does make it bigger. It makes it manageable. It turns confusion into curiosity and curiosity into discernment. And if you know others who wrestle with similar questions, not loudly but quietly, sharing this perspective can be an act of care. Not because it exposes danger, but because it offers stability. In times when so much information competes for attention, grounded voices matter. Staying connected, staying thoughtful, staying rooted, those are not dramatic acts, but they are powerful ones. What comes next, we'll continue exploring how these patterns show up in places most people never think to look, not to create suspicion, but to deepen clarity. Because clarity, once it takes hold, does defade easily. It becomes a way of seeing. And seeing clearly is one of the most underrated forms of freedom there is.